All right, while everybody else is coming in and they're scattered throughout the building, we're going to get started here. We're in Genesis 3, so if anybody comes in and they want to know where we're at, we're still in Genesis 3. We talked about the first 7 verses last week, so let's review that, and then I want to try and get as through verse 16. I don't have slides, so I'm going to use the whiteboard, but let's reread. I want to read all of chapter 3. Then I want to review the first 7 verses very briefly and then start in verse 8, talking about stuff through verse 16. And I'll explain why when we get there. All right. This is the NIV I'm reading from. You're reading from the NLT? New Living Translation? Okay, and then I'm just going to read from the New Living. I got it here on my iPad. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals Yahweh God had made. One day he asked the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any of the trees in the garden?" "Of course we may eat fruit from the trees of the garden," the woman replied. "It's only the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. God said, you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die." "You won't die," the serpent replied to the woman. "God knows that your eyes will be opened and as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. When the cool evening breeze was blowing, the man and his wife heard Yahweh God walking about in the garden, so they hid from Yahweh God among the trees. Then Yahweh God called to the man, "Where are you?" He replied, "I heard you walking in the garden, so I hid. I was afraid because I was naked." "Who told you you were naked?" Yahweh God asked. "Have you eaten from the trees from which I commanded you not to eat?" The man replied, "It was the woman you gave me, who gave me the fruit, and I ate." Then Yahweh God asked the woman, "What have you done?" "The serpent deceived me," she replied. "That's why I ate." Then Yahweh God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all the animals, domestic and wild. You will crawl on your belly, groveling in the dust all as long as you live. And I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." Then he said to the woman, "I will sharpen the pain of your pregnancy. In pain you will give birth, and you will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you." To the man he said, "Since you listened to the voice of your wife and ate from the tree, whose fruit I commanded you not to eat, the ground is cursed because of you. All your life you will struggle to catch a living from it. Scratch a living, rather. It will grow thorns and thistles for you, though you will eat of its grains. By the sweat of your brow you will have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you were made. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return." Then the man, Adam, named his wife Eve, because she would be the mother of all the living. And Yahweh God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. Then Yahweh God said, "Look, the human beings have become like us, knowing good and evil. What if they reach out, take fruit from the tree of life, and eat it? Then they will live forever." So Yahweh God banished them from the garden, and he sent Adam out to cultivate the ground from which he has been made. After sending them out, Yahweh God stationed mighty cherubim to the east of the Garden of Eden, and he placed a flaming sword that flashed back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So that is all of chapter 3. Let's go back and review chapter 3, 1 through 7 that we talked about last week. Who are the 2 main characters in the first 7 verses? Who speaks? Good. The serpent and the woman. Very good, Logan. They're the only 2 characters that spoke, and so we took just that chunk of text last week. What I want to do this week is I want to deal with the consequences between these 2 characters. And then next week, I want to come back and finish chapter 3 by predominantly talking about the man and Adam and all of his responsibility / fault in this scene. So I'm not picking on the woman by categorizing her with the serpent. today and last week. I'm just grouping it together for the sake of continuity week to week. So, last week, the serpent came along, and he was who or what? What is he? Is he an actual serpent? So then what is he if he's not an actual serpent? Good. He's one of the Elohim, so he's one of the gods, one of these celestial beings that inhabits God's kingdom capital on earth, that is Eden. So you would expect these beings to be there. God is not the only celestial being that inhabits Eden. All of his council, when they were going to meet on earth, where would they meet on earth? Eden. You'd expect them all to be there. So he's not showing up out of the blue, although it often looks that way to us because we don't know how to parse and think about Eden the way the ancients would. So, and the serpent comes along and he asks questions. He says, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? I'm switching back to the NIV as I'm going through this. So he adds this qualifying idea. Did God really say you must not eat? Now, what had God actually said in chapter 2? You are free. You are free to eat from all the trees. So the serpent introduces this notion of doubt. Did God really say you must not eat? And the woman's response says, we may eat fruit from the trees of the garden, but God did say you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. So we saw two things about what she said in that statement thus far. She says, one, we may eat, which is kind of, she's not acknowledging their freedom. Now remember, who was the only person around, only human around, when God said this statement? Good. Adam. I like it. Hebrew enunciation. I'll get behind that. And so the woman was not there when God said you're free to eat from all the trees, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God specifically called it by name, but here the woman says it's just the tree that's in the middle of the garden. So she's downplaying their freedom and God's command. For her, it seems to be another arbitrary tree. For whatever reason, there's one tree that we can't eat from, and she doesn't show any signs that she understands the reasoning. God calls it by name because he wants them to understand this is the tree that if you eat from it, you are deciding for yourself what you want to be right and wrong. That is what the tree represents. So, why did the serpent come and talk to her? Because she wasn't there when God gave this command. She's in a way more vulnerable to the test and the temptation the serpent is going to turn the test into. So he's asking her these questions, probing, trying to get her to reveal her perspective. Her perspective is, it's just another tree, and for some reason we can't eat from it. She's not clarifying what it is, but she goes on to clarify something God didn't actually say, which was what? Verse 3. Right. Not only can we not eat of it, we cannot touch it. But God never said that. So she doesn't have the best grasp on what God has and has not said and why God has and has not said what he has said. This is why I think it's important. You need to know not only what God has said, but you need to understand why God has said something, because there's always a reason. Good literature encapsulates these ideas just through a handful of words. And you're supposed to be connecting these phrases and stories back to what has previously been said. God also said, on the day that you eat from it, you will be doomed to die. But the serpent outright says in verse 4, you will not be doomed to die, which could mean either you won't die at all or, hey, you won't die right away. Either way, he's drawing attention away from the consequences of disobeying God. He says, instead, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You will be like the gods. You could translate that second God in the NLT as like the gods. That one could be plural. At the end of the chapter, you see when he banishes them from the garden, he says they're now like one of us, the same plurality as chapter 1. The same celestial council that God is addressing is at the end of chapter 3, as in the beginning of the end of chapter 1, when he says, let us make man in our image. Right there in verse 4, it goes from a singular God, the king of the council, knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like the gods, knowing good and evil. If knowing good and evil means deciding for yourself what is right and wrong, the serpent is just outright denying that, one, not only will you die, but even we gods, we celestial beings here, all of us get to decide what's right and wrong. So he's outright lying about that. The celestial beings do not get to decide what is right and wrong. But he's trying to say, look, God is holding something back from you. Be suspicious of that. Did God really say, introducing doubt and suspicion? And hey, just so you know, the rest of us, we get to decide stuff that you don't. Don't you want to be like us? And it's an outright lie. The celestial beings don't get to decide what is right and wrong. But this celestial being doesn't like what God has done. This serpent, this nachash in Hebrew. Say nachash. Can you make your guttural sound in your throat? Nachash. Good, Grant. Nachash. It's kind of an onomatopoeia. It sounds like what it's representing. It sounds like a serpent. Nachash. And it rolls off the tongue that way so that you get a bit of a serpentine feel in the way you pronunciate it. And so, I'm just throwing that out there. I didn't mention that last week. He's trying to say, look, we're greater than y'all, and we get this privilege that you don't get, and God's the reason you don't get this privilege, but you can have it if you reach out and eat this fruit. And so the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, which, as I pointed out last week, is the exact opposite of how it's phrased in chapter 2. When God creates everything and he makes the plants grow up in the garden, he says the writer describes it as pleasing to the eye and good for food. Why does it get flipped around here? Because something else is upside down. You remember what or who? What? Eve. Okay. Very good. Eve is upside down in her thinking. What's up, Nick? Eve is upside down in her thinking. So the phrase is inverted specifically to show her point of view, her perspective is upside down, and then it adds something. Oh, the fruit is also useful for gaining wisdom, which I put in parentheses because I think this is a pseudo-wisdom. This is false wisdom. It looks like wisdom, but it's really not. But she thinks it is because she's upside down. And this tells us something about us now. We all think that we're doing the right thing all the time. We all think that our actions are justified because we are just as upside down in our thinking as Adam and Eve were in this moment, but it's specifically from Eve's perspective. We'll get to Adam next week. So she reaches out, she takes it. Adam gets some too. He takes and eats as well. Then the eyes of both of them were open. They realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. So, this is where we're at in plot points for chapter 3. At the end of chapter 3, there's 3 villains, not just one. At the beginning of chapter 3, 1 villain, the serpent. Here in verse 7, there are now 3 villains, because a villain is somebody who thinks that they're always right and does what's right in their own eyes and thinks themselves the heroes for doing it. All 3 of these beings right here fit that bill, and so do we all. Now we come along, and these heroes are now trying to, or these heroes in their own mind, but really villains, are trying to fix the problem as best they can. Cover your nakedness, cover your shame, cover yourself up, and hide yourself even from your spouse. And as they're doing this, and they're hiding, we come to verse 8. The man and the woman heard the sound of Yahweh God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of day, and they hid from Yahweh God among the trees. Now, verse 8, I know when we read it in the NLT, it says, the cool evening breeze was blowing, and it tries to give you the time of day. This is a very common way to translate this. Like, oh, it's evening time, the wind was blowing, everything was starting to cool off, and God was just strolling along peaceably. That's not what's happening here. Because the real hero of the story is showing up. But what does the hero do whenever he encounters villains in a story? Let me ask you this before we dive into this. What is the first thing God does when we sin? Speak louder, Grant. I can't hear you over the humming of this right here. Okay. Anything else? What is God's first reaction to sin? Grant says he tries to help us. Anybody want to throw anything else out? What does God actually do in this chapter? Okay. What's up, Zane? He asks questions, including, where are you? That's his first question. He asked, 4 questions total in this passage? 3 to the man, 1 to the woman. Okay. And then what does he do? What is chapter 3 about? We called it the rebellion last week. What does God do when we sin and rebel? Okay. Logan says punish. But before he punishes, he comes along and he asks questions. This is a pattern that you will see over and over and over again in the Bible. Whenever we rebel, God, he probes the situation. He doesn't rush to judgment, but he looks at the situation and he asks questions. Whenever a group or an individual sins, he will typically come and say something like, "What have you done? Explain to me your actions." He calls us to account and demands that we explain our actions. You're free, as he said in chapter 2, you're free and you can make just about any actions you want, but you violate his commands. And he punishes, that's one way you could say it. I'm going to say he judges sin. And usually in judging sin, there's a specific punishment. Somehow, some way. What do you typically hear people say that God does with sin? Like, he just right away does what? It's a wrong answer, but it's the answer most people give. What do you typically think or hear people say? Well, God just what's with sin? He just, yeah, exactly. Forgives. Very good. He just forgives sin. No, he doesn't. He judges sin. Always, because God is the hero of the story. And the hero of the story doesn't let evil go unpunished. But what if he loves the people? Well, let's try and examine some of this judgment and get into it. So, part of the reason this is not God just calmly walking through the garden in a peaceful state of mind is because he's there to judge sin. Sin has happened. Rebellion has occurred in the celestial territory and in the terrestrial human territory. When it says they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of day, first off, the sound could be a lot of different things. Oftentimes when you hear the sound of God moving, it's thunder. And the cool of day doesn't tell you the time of day. In some context, it's telling you about a storm or a whirlwind. And so what if we actually translated verse 8 and they heard the thunder of God moving through the garden in the whirlwind, and so they hid from Yahweh God among the trees? You could translate it that way. You will find oftentimes that the reason things are translated the way that they are in the most popular passages in the Bible is just because they're the most popular passages in the Bible. And a bunch of people who think they know what the Bible says don't want what their Bible says in their minds to be messed with. But this is a judgment scene. God is coming specifically in judgment. He's coming to act as the judge, which is why his question is, where are you? It changes the tone of the story, doesn't it? But that's a little more accurate to what's going on here. So why does he ask the question, where are you? Does he not know? Can God not tell once you've sinned? Good, Logan. He's when he comes as judge and he asks questions, it's an opportunity for us to actually admit, confess to what we've done, own up to it, take responsibility for what you've done. Because you might find that God is a more merciful judge if you will actually own up to what you've done. Have you ever had your parents do this? Have they ever knowingly asked you what you've done when they already know what you've done? Once or twice? Uh-huh. Your math may be off a little there, Logan. Yeah. So you can't fool your parents. When they ask you what happens, sometimes they don't know, but oftentimes they know darn good and well what you've done. They're giving you a chance to own up to it, so when they discipline you or punish you for it, the consequences can be less because you came to them, or at least when they came to you, you said, think of George Washington, that famous, maybe apocryphal story. He chopped down the cherry tree or something, and he says, "I cannot tell a lie, Father. I chopped down the cherry tree." Kind of an interesting story, but you see there that if you're willing to be honest about your own actions and what you've done, oftentimes you find mercy in the judgment. So, where are you? And Adam says, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." His questions aren't done yet. He's got two more questions for the man in verse 11. Who told you that you were naked? But he doesn't wait for an answer. Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? Now, notice here that God doesn't call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think that's interesting because he called it that before, but now he's wording it in such a way where it doesn't matter what the tree is called. What matters is that God said, don't eat from it. And so his language is emphatic to say, did you do what I told you not to do? Like the scene in The Lion King? Yes, that is honestly what I was thinking of all week long. When Mufasa tells Simba, you deliberately disobeyed me. This is exactly what I wanted you to think about. Because Mufasa is the good king. Scar is the bad king. He's the tempter who tempted Simba, the kid who doesn't know any better, to go to the place where Mufasa said, you must never go there. That is beyond our borders. And so now that Simba's caught, and they have to have that talk, Mufasa says, you deliberately disobeyed me. Now you have to understand why that's bad. Okay, very good, Grant. And so he says, have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you? And what does the man say/do in verse 12? Okay, he says, I need an eraser so I don't run out. So what does he do then? So what in broad terms is he doing? Good, he's passing the buck and blaming the woman. Now, we're going to talk about this more next week, about why this is entirely Adam's fault. But yes, what he does, and the way the story is structured, is you get this. A, B, C, C, B, A. Okay? If you care to know, although you don't have to remember this term, this is called a chiasm or a chiastic structure. It's a Hebrew way of making things work narratively. Topic, 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 work backwards in those topics. So what he does is God comes along, questions the man. The man passes the blame to who? And so what God does is then he questions the woman. And what does the woman do? Blames the serpent. And so either if you don't say question the man, you either say man blames woman. These are just somewhat the titles we use. Man blames woman. Woman blames serpent. Serpent, as the old joke goes, doesn't have a leg to stand on. Oops, I'm repeating my phrase here, but that's not what I wanted to write. The serpent doesn't get a question. Instead, what happens is that working from the serpent, God judges the serpent, and we'll talk about what that means here and what the crawling means. Then he judges the woman, and then he judges the man. And part of the reason why we're going to take the man's judgment separately is not only because he is the most culpable person, but he also has the longest judgment, even longer than the serpent's. So this is how the story unfolds. God shows up. The great, good king and hero of the story has to keep things from devolving further and has to set things right. The rebellion in his kingdom. This is what good kings do. This is what the hero of the story does. What you see is that God, as the good king, comes to punish evil. He does not let evil and sin go unpunished, ever. A lot of people ask the question, if God is good, why is this world thrown into such disorder, destruction, chaos, and ruled by death? The answer is because of us. We got exactly the world we wanted. This is not God's fault that the world is the way that it is. There is nothing in God's nature that demands God cannot let evil happen. The only two things about God's nature is, one, he cannot participate in the evil, and two, he must judge the evil. Those are the only two limitations on God when it comes to evil. But God alone, as we talked about last week, is the only perfect and infallible being. All the other beings can potentially sin, rebel, and commit evil. So the story is unfolding here in a way that it happens. So the woman passes the blame to the serpent in verse 13. And so Yahweh God said to the serpent, because you have done this. So there's nobody else to question. And he doesn't bother questioning the serpent, which I think is interesting, though I don't fully know what to make of that. God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. Now, this is part of the reason why it's important to notice that this is not a literal snake. Because a lot of people think that this is some zoology lesson where they teach that, oh, God created snakes to have legs. And then he cursed the snakes and took their legs away. That is stupid. That doesn't make any sense of the ancient ideas encapsulated in this story. No Hebrew is tracking on this as a zoology lesson to think that serpents used to have legs. And you should not either. The idea of you will crawl on your belly is like this. And I wanted to put this on a slide, but I don't have slides, so I'm just going to draw this out. Do you remember when we looked at kind of pyramid cosmic structures? This was, 2 weeks ago, the last time we reviewed it. How God put everything in order, right? Now, God was at the top of the pyramid, and just in broad strokes, who's directly underneath God? Sorry, you all spoke at once. Okay, we don't have to get that specific. Just what class of beings, Okay, I'm just gonna summarize it. All the celestial beings are above them, and who's underneath the celestial beings? Yes, but I'm just including all of the categories in celestials. So if you go all the celestial angelic beings, from sons of God, cherubim, and angels that we looked at, Who's directly next in line? Good. Humans. And then who or what is underneath humans? Good. Good, good, good. If I could spell animals right, that would help. And then underneath animals, you just kind of get the land, all of the inanimate objects. I'll just summarize it here as land. But so what happens here is that in humans trying to reach out and go up, they're going to come down, but they're not the only ones. The celestial being is trying to undo, the serpent is trying to undo what God has established in order so that he can exalt himself. He's trying to go up, and God says, therefore, you will be cast down. And this language of eating dust, first off, it's tied to the underworld, but we're not going to go into that. The point is to say, when you wanted to go up, I will cast you down. This language of eating dust, crawling on your belly, is to say you will be humiliated, you will be trampled on, you will be lower than you want to be because you have tried to exalt yourself. That's all. It's a very broad picture. Now, what do you notice about verse 14? Just look at it in your Bible and tell me what's different. And what does verse 14 mean? About why does it look different? Good. It's poetry. So you need to slow down and you need to grasp the poetic nature. Being shoved down in the dust is a portrait of defeat. It's what you would do to your enemies if you beat them in battle. So he says, you tried to exalt yourself, I will cast you down. Specifically tied to the underworld because the dirt, the grime, and everything was in the underworld. And so later authors are going to reflect back on divine rebellion like Genesis 3. And they're going to deliberately mention the underworld. And this is kind of why. The dust, the ground, the lowest places in the pecking order. So if you wanted to, what you could do is you could say the land, and then under here, you could say the underworld. This gloomy, defeated place where all the dead, defeated people go. That's where you're going to be cast to. That's where you're going. You're not going up the pecking order. You're going down. And notice he says this. He says, cursed are you. Because we read the whole chapter, so think back to the whole chapter. Does anybody else get cursed? The term only comes up one more time in the chapter. It's when Adam is being judged, and he says, cursed is the ground because of you in verse 17. So while God deliberately curses the serpent, he doesn't even curse man. See how merciful that is? He would be fully within his right to curse man. We'll talk about why here in just a moment if we have time. Otherwise, we'll get to it next week. So the one who tried to exalt himself is going to be cast down. And then look at verse 15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring, or seed. The NIV said, or the NLT, sorry, just says offspring. Between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. The NLT says, he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. Now, that's perfectly justifiable to translate it. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. First off, the verse says, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. This is a poetic statement of saying, now the battle begins. And I will make a distinction between the people who follow you, those will be your seeds, and the people who will descend from this woman, and what's implied is who will follow me. This is the beginning of spiritual warfare, as we call it. Now the serpent has some people. Now the humans will have some other people who will not join the serpent's side as they themselves have. But ultimate victory will come. The seed of the woman. First off, that's an abnormal phrase because seed is usually thought of in terms of the man. The man has the seed, but as we go through Genesis in broad strokes, you're going to have to learn to track who the seed is. And when Genesis is over and the Old Testament continues, you are still looking for a seed. a seed of David. You're looking for a seed of the tribe of Judah. You're looking for the first and final seed. The first seed, when you get to the book of Genesis, is going to be Abraham. And out of Abraham, the seed is going to become Israel. But Israel, corporately, is a failure. So out of the seed, God is going to bring, and you'll see it in your English translations, one seed, singular. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Or in the NLT, he will strike your head, and you will crush his heel. Or you will strike his heel, sorry. So the NLT keeps both words strike. The NIV translates crush and strike. It's the same Hebrew word, that's why the NLT has done it. But Genesis likes its wordplay, especially here in these early chapters. A lot of the narrative is built on wordplay. So the NIV has kept the wordplay in. Have you ever seen The Passion of the Christ? So there's a scene in the beginning of the movie, and it opens up with Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane the night that he's about to be betrayed and turned over to be crucified. And Satan's there whispering in his ear, and you see a snake literally come out from Satan, and he crushes the head of the snake. So they're metaphorically portraying this verse. It's called the first gospel, oftentimes, because it's the first mention that you get of a messianic, or what would ultimately become a messianic figure. A seed who would redeem and save by destroying the serpent, casting him once and for all down into the depths and the defeated places. Look at Romans 16, verse 20. Turn there real quick. Romans 16, verse 20. The last chapter in Romans. Romans 16:20. Paul says this as he closes his letter to the Romans. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you. So, he's reflecting back on this passage. But who's the seed there? He says the Lord Jesus. But who's actually crushing the head of the serpent? It's the Roman believers. It's the people who take Jesus' side in this cosmic warfare. This seed of the woman, this distinction between the woman and the serpent, really it's the distinction between a specific seed of the woman that's going to fight the serpent. It's not just all the humans. It's a specific seed, and Genesis as a story that we're going to read is going to flesh out, of all the options, what seed is it? And the answer is it's Israel. But Israel throughout the Old Testament, if you track the seed, is a failure. So it boils it down to some line of David is going to come along and finish this war. And then you turn the page in the Old Testament unfinished to the New Testament, and you see the seed is a specific descendant of David. The seed is Jesus. And out of Jesus comes all of the seeds reborn. All of the people who will crush the devil and defeat his army and his enemies. And ultimately, this battle and this fight is not done yet. And it keeps going. And it's ongoing today. But ultimately, there will be an end. There will be victory to it. But until then, we still have to live with the consequences of what we have done.